So it seems that the next and last Warhammer 40K balanced data slate is coming next week. What sort of changes can we expect in the swan song of 9th edition? Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about the upcoming balanced data slates for 40k. It seems that we've got some very good odds that the next data slate will probably be coming out next week, most likely on Thursday. So I thought we'd take a video to take a quick look as to how some of the top and bottom factions of 40k are getting on, and a few things as to what sort of rules are going to be on this new data slate. So first up, with Games Workshop's news cycle over for the week, it does seem that we're probably going to be getting this next week. In the previous previews that Games Workshop have talked about for this one, they said that it will be coming after Adepticon and around about Easter time. Games Workshop seems to have a favourite day for releasing these data slates. The last few of them have been on the Thursday, and over the past few weeks it looks like the other gaming systems data slates have been coming out. We've had the Kill Team and the Age of Sigmar one both on Thursdays as well, so I'd say that we're probably odds on to get the 40k one next Thursday, though I guess it's certainly possible it could be a bit sooner. Of course, with all the news of 10th edition that Games Workshop is coming out with, this one will likely be the final update of 9th edition Warhammer 40k. Games Workshop's last tweaks to make a few final adjustments to this version of the game. I'd guess that the only other rules that are coming out for mainstream 40k before 10th edition might be Lionel Johnson's Primarch datasheet, and I guess potentially Primaris rules for Commander Dante as well, if they are releasing his miniature this edition and not saving him for 10th. I feel like this one might be a little bit more muted than some of them, though I'm still going to find it pretty interesting myself. I guess just quite a lot of people are kind of mentally moving on to prepare for the new edition at this point, so might potentially not be quite as super interested as to the last lights of 9th edition coming through, though I certainly would bear in mind that we've probably got another 2 or 3 months worth of 9th edition left to go. Plenty more chance for games, and there's going to be lots of tournaments in that time as well. So it's absolutely going to be relevant, and it's going to be interesting to see what they do with it. In general, I feel like Games Workshop have done pretty well with implementing these balanced data slates throughout 9th. They've been perhaps one of the biggest drivers to actually making the armies be somewhat on par with each other towards the tail end of the edition, as opposed to the slightly catastrophic power creep that we had towards the start of the edition, where the latest codex was basically on top for most of the edition. I guess they'll likely be continuing with these into 10th edition. They're still going strong with them for Kill Team and Age of Sigmar. Seems like a pretty reasonable way to add updates to the game without overloading people with changes. Of course, perhaps the most interesting thing is what will be addressed on the data slate. This is something that we've talked about in previous videos, but I thought I might just swing back to it and see how the top and bottom armies in the game are getting on, as to what Games Workshop might try and choose to fix. As with these mid-season ones, I wouldn't expect them to be changing the points values for units in any major way. The update for this one's almost certainly going to focus on unit and army rules, and for that reason I don't think it's going to be a massive great hammer blow that's going to rebalance every single faction in the game. I expect the mid-tier factions to be largely untouched, and I don't suspect that they'll be making massive amounts of effort to make their internal balance better at this pass. What I would expect though is a few basic rules changes to some of the armies at the very top of the tree and the armies at the very bottom, just to try and push them a bit more into the midfield. From a quick look at current tournament win rates, it does still seem that the usual suspects are at the top. Genestealer Cults, Dark Angels and Iron Hands are all doing spectacularly well. They'd be outside of Games Workshop's win rate bracket that they try and keep armies in. They usually say that anything above 55% is a problem. Otherwise, hovering around the borderline area are World Eaters and Chaos Demons, and there are a fair few factions on the upper end of the power scale as well. Custodians, Guards and Orcs are all around about the 52-53 percentage points, and Eldar are around about there too. Meanwhile, at the bottom end of the power spectrum, there's really quite a lot of armies around about the 45% mark, but the ones that really stand out are these ones, particularly Deathwatch on 38% wins and Thousand Suns on around about 41. I feel like they're almost certainly going to get something to help them out, and other potential contenders could be things like Chaos Space Marines, which definitely seem to be on the lower scale, plus perhaps some of the weaker Space Marine chapters if you're considering them independently. Armies like Ultramarines, Imperial Fists, Raven Guard and White Scars are generally doing a little bit worse than most. So let's go through those and talk about a few ways in which Games Workshop might choose to address them. Obviously they've always got the possibility of doing something completely out of left field, a major change to the game like we had with Armour of Contempt for example, or other far more clever ways to address a faction's weaknesses that haven't been done before. If they were just trying to address some of the major things that make some of the armies strong though, then let's just go through with a few ideas. First up, I'd say that the Genestealer cults are quite likely to have their secondaries reined in. Changing secondary objectives is quite a reasonable one, I think, for balancing the match play. It doesn't really affect the people who play at a more casual level and perhaps don't use them quite as much. In particular, the Brood Swarm and Ambush ones are just very, very powerful for the Genestealer cults, some of the very best secondaries in the game with their army abilities. I do kind of wonder if they actually really need to address the power level of the actual Genestealer cult units. I feel in general they just tend to outscore the opponents and can still be kind of fragile once you actually catch up with them, maybe not necessarily winning the damage game overall. I feel like if they make their secondaries significantly harder to score, that might be alright, make the insurgency work a bit harder for their points. For armies like Dark Angels and Iron Hands, they have a bit of a weirder state of affairs, being basically Space Marine sub-factions, but just generally having stronger rules than a bunch of the other armies. Perhaps the single most obvious change that I believe that they mentioned in a previous preview was the Codex Warfare secondary objective. That's the one for killing units in the appropriate doctrine. For some reason, the Devastator one was left at scoring double points for that one because you used to only have it for one turn. I feel like that's almost guaranteed to change and would probably deny these armies a little bit of victory points from either Raven Wing guns or the many heavy weapons of the Iron Hands. I feel like perhaps one of the main reasons that these two are just enormously stronger than some of the rest is that they both have some very nice Devastator doctrines, and they're just super easy to use now you've gone from being able to use them for exactly one turn to having them all game long. It's super powerful whether it's the boosted move of the Raven Wing or the reroll ones to hit and move and shoot of the Iron Hands. Just as a potential, you could maybe think about locking the Devastator doctrine to just maybe the first 2 or 3 turns potentially. I feel like maybe that could be a good middle ground, somewhere between only having it active for one turn and having it all game long no holds barred. I feel like perhaps that could make them on a bit more of a level playing field with some of the other chapters that make more use of the tactical or assault. Otherwise, given their recent tournament success, I might not be too surprised to see some sort of change to Desolation squads. Maybe might not be super necessary if they do change Devastator Doctrine in some way. At the moment though, they do seem to be kind of auto-include in at least a fair few Space Marine armies, and Dark Angels and Iron Hands basically seem to be the best places for them. Otherwise, I feel like the Dark Angels rules in general might come under fire here, maybe not if they make other changes, but I feel like Dark Angels have just been a tricky army to balance with Space Marines the entire time that their codex has been out, just with their rules like Jink and the Inner Circle rule making their Terminators and Bikes just vastly better than what other chapters can field them like. It just means that if Terminators are just fairly strong for Space Marines, then Dark Angels will make them even stronger. Kind of hard to balance them against that with armies like Ultramarines perhaps. I guess you could maybe adjust that with Dark Angels having to pay a little bit more points for their Terminators maybe, or otherwise I guess it will be toning down the rules, though neither of those really seem ideal. Otherwise, my guess would be for the next 2 armies most likely to at least take some flack might be either Demons or World Eaters. In one of their preview videos, they did say that as well as addressing the top factions in the game, they might well be looking at the ones that might rise up to take their place, and these guys perhaps seem a level above the rest of the competition. My guess would be that if they do anything to these guys, and I'm not sure that they will, that they'd probably nerf things like the secondary objectives as opposed to the core way that the army plays. Or I guess they could do something minor or major to some of the auto-include units within the codexes, say perhaps toning down someone like Lord Invocatus out of the World Eaters, or maybe the Lord of Change or Exalted Bloodthirster out of the Chaos Demons, units that really quite a lot of competitive armies tend to run. Say for Lord Invocatus, something like reducing his pre-game move ability would be a significant nerf to the World Eaters as a faction, and maybe also balance up the HQ choices just a little bit more. Otherwise, at the other end of the spectrum, for the weaker Space Marine chapters, things like Imperial Fist and friends, I am a bit skeptical as to whether or not Games Workshop is going to do anything for them. They really have quite studiously ignored them for the entire time up to now. I feel like GW just aren't super keen on making each and every sub-faction 100% viable within 40k, and are more trying to balance factions as a whole, and they see these guys as just extensions of Space Marines, as opposed to a faction that needs balancing in its own right. I feel like it would go down really well if they did give something like Imperial Fist at least a little bit of a bump with this. They do seem to have been having the entirety of 9th edition basically being the weakest Space Marine chapter out of the entire bunch. Would be quite fun just to give them maybe even more amped up bolters, perhaps double exploding sixes or some other special rule, or some sort of buff to their Devastator doctrine, which just seems so much worse than the Iron Hands one at the moment. Would be kind of nice just to give them a little bit more of a chance to be playable. So far they haven't really given us any indication that they're going to help out specific codex chapters though. They only seem to look at the Divergent ones plus Standard Space Marines. Speaking of the Divergent chapters though, Deathwatch do absolutely need something to help them out. I feel like there might be a couple of fairly obvious things that they could do if they wanted to. They could certainly do something more creative. I feel like a change to their combat doctrines seems very likely. The flexible picking of them was really quite a nice advantage previously, but now it's actually a bit of a liability and could be weaker than standard Space Marine doctrines, never mind the fact that they don't actually get their own unique one. I guess it could be some sort of other layered rule to it, maybe make their tactical doctrine better or something. Or you could just give them super flexibility and just say you can pick your own combat doctrine every turn. That would be a significant advantage if they don't have an extra super doctrine special rule. Another option that Games Workshop did with the Adeptus Mechanicus could be to roll in rules from their Kill Team Strike Force Army of Renown. The AdMech had kind of similar with buffs to bionics going onto their standard units. You could perhaps take some of the core mechanics of the Kill Team Strike Force and just push it on standard Deathwatch kill teams. They could resurrect that mechanic where they were allowed to pick their own chapter traits each turn. Say the army going into a turn of White Scars chapter tactics for some advance and charges, or having a turn of Iron Hands for the Feel No Pain. That seemed like quite a fun one, and doesn't look like it'd be too overpowered if they just kept it to the standard kill teams. For the other most obvious ones, it does seem that Thousand Suns are firmly in their crosshairs from the past video that they did on them. Again, they really do need something to help them out a fair bit, though exactly how you'd buff Thousand Suns with rules I think is maybe a little bit less clear. I guess you could certainly make their secondaries a little bit stronger. They did get worse in Arcs of Omen, and I guess that's probably contributed to them being fairly down low in the rankings. I feel like they could probably do with something else though. I feel like one of their major things was they lost Armor of Contempt, and then their core units like Rubrics and Scarabs didn't really get any significant points cuts to adjust from that. I feel like small points drops on those two would be absolutely fine, though they don't tend to mess around with points in these updates that much. Otherwise, I guess it would be reimagining some sort of additional buff to layer on them. Maybe a durability or a psychic buff seems the most likely given what they do. Not entirely sure what they might go for. To me, they do feel like a faction that would probably be sorted out quite well with a secondary change and a few points drops. They've already got quite a lot of complicated stuff going on before adding more. Otherwise though, it'll be interesting to see how far they go on this one. I feel like they could certainly go one of two ways, just maybe go fairly light touch and not try and detract people's attention from 10th edition too much by making massive changes to the game, or equally they could go a little bit wild seeing as it's the last one of the edition, one last hurrah for 9th edition before we move on into 10th. If they did decide to shake things up, then a whole bunch of other factions could see improvements, Chaos Space Marines perhaps, or Tyranids, or any of the other ones ranked fairly low. I guess we'll wait and see on that front though. By all accounts, it doesn't sound like we'll have all that long to wait before the news comes out. In any case though, let me know what you think down in the comments below. What are your guys' predictions for the spring balanced data slate, and what would you like to see to help out or hinder these weak or strong factions? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.